One, speaking personally, because I don't think the U.S. interests at stake are vital. They're not nearly the most important interest the United States has in the greater Middle East, given all that's going on there, much less the rest of the world. And I also think the difficult part of this process or this intervention have yet to come. And there's all sorts of scenarios. There's the scenarios where the intervention, quote unquote, succeeds. Either you have a ceasefire, and then what do you do? Because you have these opposing armies, these opposing sides in place. Or you can have situations where the intervention fails. And you have all sorts of questions then about what the United States does with Gaddafi. And even if it does succeed again, then we have all sorts of fundamental issues about exactly who it is we're helping. And are we so sure that the opposition will necessarily pursue an agenda that is in the interests of the United States or in the interests of the people of Libya? I'm very uncomfortable with such a large commitment, given all these unknowns.
Go ahead, Jane, you want to talk.
Well, our Deputy National Security Advisor, Dennis McDonough, called the situation pre-no-fly zone Srebrenica on steroids. This is the Benghazi situation. And that, to remind viewers, is about what happened in Bosnia. We had a no-fly zone going, and yet there was this hellacious massacre in Srebrenica, and we only ended that conflict when we armed the Bosnians and the Croats. And then finally, Richard Holbrooke, our fabulously talented ambassador, who died just a few months ago, negotiated a settlement in Dayton. Why do I mention this? Yeah. I mention this because there is no magic in a no-fly zone. I believe that the purposes of this mission have not been adequately articulated yet, and it also is not the late 90s. This is post 9/11, when we are involved in two interventions on the ground in Muslim countries. And so I think the context matters a lot, and I'm not sure enough thought was given to that, and there still is this conflict about what our mission truly is.
And let me bring that to Bob Kagan. I mean, there is a conflict about what the mission is. The United States says that Gaddafi must go. Members of the coalition say this is strictly a humanitarian mission. How can the coalition work together when they can't agree on what the goals are?
Well, the United States is not the only government that has said that Gaddafi must go, and I think the way things are being finessed right now with NATO in charge of the military operation overall, but it's clear that the United States, the United Kingdom, and France are free to do what they think is necessary. I think it's clear that first of all, it's not just a no-fly zone. We've got coalition forces attacking Gaddafi's tanks and artillery on the ground. The goal is clearly to help the opposition. I think we need to do more. I think we should be arming the opposition, because we can't end up at the end of the day with Gaddafi in power. I also don't think we are going to wind up with Gaddafi in power. I think there's far too much pessimism. We never know. You know, Gloria, we start wars, whether it's World War I, World War II, the Civil War. We don't know. We don't know everything. And this demand that we have to know how something ends before we take any action whatsoever, that would be truly debilitating. We would never do anything if we did that. I think there's a reasonable assumption that Gaddafi's forces are ultimately going to break from him if it looks like their lives are on the line. I think we have to have a little patience. This thing's been going on for 5 days, and people are running around and screaming as if we've already failed. I think a little patience is necessary, and this is an important interest of ours, by the way. What's happening in the Middle East is connected to what's going on in Libya. If we stand by and let a dictator in the region like Gaddafi slaughter his people, that's a terrible setback and not in America's interests.
Well, Richard Haas calls this a war of choice. Obviously, you don't think so.
No, of course it's a war of choice. 99% of all the wars that the United States has ever fought have been wars of choice. I can barely think of a war that we fought, maybe World War II, that was not a war of choice. The question is it a good choice or a bad choice? Richard seems to think if he says it's a war of choice, that's the end of the discussion. The question is it a good choice? I think it is.
Richard, I'll let you respond to that.
No, I think the United States has had a number of wars of necessity beyond World War II. I would say the Korean War was a war of necessity, and I'd also say the first Gulf War was a clear war of necessity where the United States had vital national interests at stake.
How did the Korean War end?
The Korean War ended just fine in the sense that we had liberated the part of Korea that had been overtaken. The mistake in the Korean War was beginning with what began as a war of necessity, and then when MacArthur went north of the 38th parallel, we turned it into a war of choice, and that became extraordinarily expensive. I'm not against wars of choices per se, but there's a very high standard, particularly given what Jane Harman said. The United States is already involved in two, the war in Iraq and what became the war in Afghanistan when this administration expanded it. So if your interests, let me finish, if the interests aren't vital, and if you do have other policy options, then you've really got to think twice. And in my view, here, the interests are clearly less than vital. I disagree with the idea that what happens in Libya will have a fundamental impact on what happens in Egypt or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia or Syria. I simply disagree with that analysis. And again, I'm very uncomfortable with launching a military intervention, given the fact that we are setting in motion a chain of events. It's not simply that we don't know. We have no reason to be confident that the people we are trying to help prevail will institute a form of governance that will necessarily be in our or Libya's interests.
Well, that raises the question, obviously, about the rebels. I mean, who are they? And let me go to the ambassador and then to Jane Harman. Are we sure, as Richard House asked the question, are we sure that these rebels in the end are going to be exactly what we want to have there?
Well, first, to Bob Kagan's point about certainty, we're not sure. We don't, very often we have to make these kinds of decisions, particularly when it involves conflict, in the absence of all the facts. Sometimes you have to act on an urgent basis. But this is a committee. There are a couple of retired ministers in there, a former minister of justice, a former minister of interior, people who have worked with the previous regime. We're not entirely certain of the shape of the organization so far, but I think one of the important things we need to do is get our diplomatic representation down to Benghazi, start dealing directly with these people, and get our own assessment of what the opposition is shaping up to become. On the question of the vitality of the interest, if I could just make one point of what Richard said earlier, I would agree that the interests may not be entirely vital. But let's not forget that in terms of proportionality here, we're not intervening in Libya at the level that we intervened in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a limited action by us, a limited military action within a broader political context. And we are also following and going along with the lead of other countries whose vital interests are probably more affected than ours, namely the Europeans and the Arab states.
Well, and we'll talk more about whether, in fact, the United States, if it's part of a coalition, can ever actually not lead. People mostly assume we are leading, but I know Jane Harman wants to get in. We're going to get back to her after the break, so I ask you all to stay with us. There's so much more to talk about. And I'd also want to mention that if you're here looking for Fareed's take on the events in Libya, we have your fill for you. Make sure you go out and pick up the latest issue of Time magazine. It's on the newsstands right now.